Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at the Peerless Hunters of the Uvenwald, Halana and Alena partners. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Halana and Alena partners are a 2/3 human with first strike and reach that costs 2, a red and a green with the following abilities. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put X+1/+1 counters on another target creature you control, where X is Halana and Alena's power. That creature gains haste until the end of the turn. Right away, we can see that these two hunters are sporting a mid-size CMC, somewhat low stats but respectable keywords for the cost, and an ability that empowers their allies by not only making them bigger but also enabling them to overcome summoning sickness. Going more in depth into this ability, it's somewhat reminiscent to Xenagos, God of Revels. Both give haste and empower the creature they target, but while Xenagos cares about the base power of the creature itself, Halana and Alena care about their own power instead, providing their target a bigger buff the stronger that they are. Not to mention, since this buff comes in the form of +1/+1 counters, it'll stick around until the creature's dealt with, allowing it to remain a threat even if our commander's not in play. So since our commander's quite adept at +1/+1 counter distribution and getting our creatures into combat, this build will be going in an aggressive +1/+1 counter theme direction with a trample sub-theme, ensuring that our pumped up creatures not only get into combat quickly, but that their damage gets through as well. Our color combination already has a vast amount of +1/+1 counter generation, enabling us to make our commander bigger quickly, and in turn allowing them to distribute even more counters to our other creatures, while also giving us access to plenty counters matter payoffs to ensure that we get additional value from our counter-laden creatures, outside of their increased stat blocks. Value like granting them trample, ensuring that our creatures' buff stat blocks can get in for damage reliably by punching through blockers. And of course, we'll also be running other trample granting effects outside of +1/+1 counters, as well as a handful of trample payoffs, ensuring that all our creatures can crash through blockers and get us extra value as they do so. Finally, we'll need to make sure that our creatures aren't easily removed once we get them powered up, so we'll be running a handful of protection sources to ensure they stick around to keep running over our opponent's creatures and their life totals for as long as possible. So let us join Halana and Alena on the hunt, as these two masters of the Uvenwald are eager to track and bring down their quarries. Together they've hunted down countless werewolves, Eldrazi, and other nameless horrors, none of which have ever eluded their blade and arrow. And as long as they have each other, these partners on the hunt and in life will never find an obstacle they cannot overcome together. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC1 slot, we have a pair of X creatures with Contortionist Troop and Ochre Jelly. Contortionist Troop is a 0/0 that comes into play with X+1/+1 counters and, on our end step, puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control if we have 3+ creatures with different powers in play, making it a scalable threat whose counter distribution effect is easily met considering the amount of varied powered creatures we have and the counter granting effects we're running. Ochre Jelly is another 0/0 that comes into play with X+1/+1 counters, this time sporting trample, that, when it dies, creates a token copy of itself with half the counters the original had, making it another scalable and surprisingly resilient and hard-hitting creature that, when dealt with, we can simply regrow back to its original size or even bigger with our other counter effects. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we start off with Bramblewood Paragon, Duskshell Crawler, and Gnarlid Colony, all of which grant trample to each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it. The first being a 2/2 that also gives any warrior that ETBs under our control a +1/+1 counter, the second being a 0/3 that gives a +1/+1 counter to any creature when it ETBs, and the last being another 2/2 that has kicker for 2 and a green that, if paid, comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, all three enabling our powered up creatures to punch through blockers while also generating +1/+1 counters for themselves or others. Then we close out this slot with Incubation Druid, a 0/2 with Adapt or 3 and double green that taps for any mana a land we control would be able to produce, or 3 mana of that color instead if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, making it a mana dork that gets significantly better once our commander or other sources get counters on it to help speed up our mana base. Reaching the CMC3 slot, we start off with a trio of trample enablers with Hornbash Mentor, Tuskguard Captain, and Pride Malkin. Hornbash Mentor is a 3/3 that, when it ETBs, puts a trample counter on target non-human creature we control, and we can pay 2, a green, and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control with trample. serving as both a way to give a counter-laden creature trample if we have no AoE sources in play, and later serving as a mana sink to distribute board-wide counters to our tramplers to make them even more dangerous. Tuskguard Captain and Pride Malkin both give all creatures we control with a +1/+1 counter on them trample, the former being a 2/3 with Outlast for a green, and the latter being a 2/1 that, when it ETBs, puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, giving us even more AoE trample sources that are able to generate +1/+1 counters for themselves or others to further our game plan. More sources of counter distribution then join us with Oran Refuse and Rishkar Pima Renegade. Oran Refuse is a 2/2 that, when it ETBs, puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, and, when it attacks, puts an additional +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature that already has one, providing us with a handy way to get an initial counter on our commander, then grow them as well as our entire board as we swing in with them turn after turn. Rishkar is another 2/2 that, when it ETBs, puts a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 target creatures and lets us tap any creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it to generate a green mana, not only giving us more counter distribution, but also turning our creatures into mana dorks for even more mana generation if needed. Some creatures that care about +1/+1 counters on themselves then join us with Verdalid, Champion of Lamholt, and Krinko Tin Street Kingpin. Verdalid is a 0/0 that comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters and lets us pay 1 a green and remove a counter from it to put a land from our deck into play tapped, going from a decent ramp source to an absurd one once we get additional counters on it, allowing us to dump our basics right into play again and again, all at instant speed. Champion of Lamholt is a 1/1 that, whenever a creature ETBs under our control, puts a +1/+1 counter on itself and also prevents all creatures with power less than it from blocking our creatures, quickly making our entire board unblockable and leaving our opponents wide open to our empowered creatures whether they have trample or not. Krinko is a 1/2 that, when he attacks, puts a +1/+1 counter on himself, then creates 1/1 goblin tokens equal to his power, flooding the board with small bodies we can use to screen attacks against us, or put counters on and go on the offensive with, either of which are good for us. Then we end this lot with a pair of elves, those being Deepwood Denizen and Evolution Sage. Deepwood Denizen is a 3/2 with Vigilance that we can pay 5 a green and tap to draw a card, which costs 1 less to activate per +1/+1 counter we have on creatures we control. Its draw ability quickly dropping to a single green, making it a very cheap source of repeatable draw, and its Vigilance still allowing us to swing in with it during combat to keep the pressure up. Evolution Sage is another 3/2 that, whenever a land ETBs under our control, proliferates, growing the counters on our creatures even further as we make our land drops return and use our land-based ramp sources. Entering the CMC4 slot, we begin with even more counter distribution with Sporeback Troll, Bloodspore Thrinax, and Renata Called to the Hunt. Sporeback Troll is a 0/0 that comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, has Graph 2, and lets us pay 1 and a green to regenerate a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, allowing us to distribute its counters as more creatures enter play thanks to Graft, and serving as a solid form of protection to keep our board intact thanks to the board-wide regeneration it provides. Both Bloodspore Thrinax and Renata have creatures we control ETB with additional +1/+1 counters on them, the former being a 2/2 with Devour 1 and having our creatures come into play with X counters, X being equal to the amount of counters it has, while the latter is a star 3 whose power is equal to our devotion to green and has our creatures ETB with 1 additional counter, both passively providing counters to our creatures as we summon them, all for no additional mana investment on our part. Forgotten Ancient and Ivy Lane Desonin then join us for yet more counter generation, the former being a 0/3 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever anyone casts a spell, letting us distribute any number of those counters on other creatures during our upkeep, and the latter being a 2/3 that puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature whenever a green creature ETBs under our control, again providing us with more passive counter distribution, though these two can grant them to creatures after they've been summoned. Then we close out our counter generation in this slot with Fangren Firstborn and Rumblebelt Raiders, both of which put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature whenever they attack, the former being a 4/2 and the latter being a 3/3, both of which give us offensive AoE counter distribution, which suits our combat-focused playstyle nicely. Next we have a pair of trample-oriented entrants with Uvenvald Oddity and Nylea God of the Hunt. Uvenvald Oddity is a 4/4 with Trample and Haste that we can pay 5 and double green to transform into Uvenvald Behemoth, an 8/8 with Trample and Haste that also grants other creatures we control those keywords in addition to a +1/+1 stat boost, coming on board relatively early to serve as a trampling beatstick that we can give counters to, which we can later transform to give a huge stat boost while empowering our board in the process. Nylea is a 6/6 enchantment creature that's indestructible and is not considered a creature unless our devotion to green is 5+, grants all other creatures we control trample, and lets us pay 3 and a green to give target creature +2/+2 until end of turn, initially serving as a hard to remove AoE source of trample and mana sink to pump our creatures, which later becomes a difficult to remove threat once it comes online for even more board pressure. Then we end this slot with some card draw sources in the form of Dragonborn Champion, Armorcraft Judge, and Mindless Automaton. Dragonborn Champion is a 5/3 trampler that, whenever a source we control deals 5 or more damage to a player, draws us a card, taking advantage of all the counter distribution effects and trample sources we have by converting it into card advantage as we swing in. Armorcraft Judge is a 3/3 that, when it ETBs, draws us a card for every creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it, reliably refilling our hands considering the amount of counter distribution effects we're running. Mindless Automaton is a 0/0 that comes into play with 2 +1/+1 counters and lets us remove 2 counters from it to draw a card, in addition to letting us pay 1 and discard a card to put a +1/+1 counter on it, giving us an instant speed and mana-less source of card advantage so long as we keep giving it counters, which is not a problem for this build. Reaching the CMC 5 slot, we have a trio of green entrants with Froghemoth, Loyal Guardian, and Trollbred Guardian. Froghemoth is a 4/4 hasty trampler that, when it deals combat damage to a player, exiles that many cards from their graveyard, putting a +1/+1 counter on itself for every creature exiled and gaining us 1 life for every non-creature exiled this way, making it a quick and hard-hitting threat that can easily pick apart our opponent's graves while growing itself and padding our life totals in the process. Loyal Guardian is another 4/4 trampler that, so long as we control our commander, gives all our creatures a +1/+1 counter at the beginning of combat, serving as a decent-sized body that will passively make all our creatures bigger and in turn make our commander more effective. Trollbred Guardian is a 5/5 with adapt for 2 and a green that gives all creatures we control with a +1/+1 counter on them trample, giving us a solid stat block that can grow itself with counters and serving as yet another source of AoE trample to add an extra layer of redundancy to our trample-focused build. Then we close out this slot with Quartzwood Crasher, a 6/6 trampler that, whenever 1 or more creatures we control with trample deal combat damage to a player, creates an XX Dinosaur Beast token with trample equal to that damage, providing us with a huge trample payoff by creating enormous trampling threats turn after turn as our pumped up creatures keep crashing in for damage. Almost at the end now, the CMC 6 slot brings us its trio of entrants with Prey Caesar Dragon, Thunderfoot Baloth, and Kogla the Titan Ape. Prey Caesar Dragon is a 4/4 flyer with Devour 2 that, when it attacks, deals damage to any target equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on itself. Our build bypassing the need for it to devour our creatures to generate counters, and serving as a repeatable source of removal or burn as it swings in. Thunderfoot Baloth is a 5/5 trampler that, so long as we control our commander, gives itself and all other creatures we control +2/+2 and trample, once again allowing our board to easily punch through blockers and providing them with a decent stat boost as well. Kogla is a 7/6 that, when it ETBs, fights up to 1 target creature we don't control, when it attacks, destroys target artifact or enchantment the defending player controls, and lets us pay 1, a green, and return a human we control back to our hand to give itself indestructible until end of turn, giving us a massive stat block, solid and repeatable removal, and decent protection for itself and our commander by helping them live through and dodge targeted removal and wipes. Finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot, we have our last creature with Barbarigmos, a 6/7 trampler that, when it deals combat damage to a player, puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, again serving as a trampling beatstick that easily gets in for damage to grow our entire board turn after turn until it's dealt with. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. The CMC 1 slot opens up with Snakeskin Veil and Vines of Vastwood, both of which prevent creatures from being targeted by our opponent's effects, the former granting the target hexproof while also giving it a +1/+1 counter, and the latter making it untargetable by effects our opponents control and if we pay its kicker cost of a green, also pumping the creature by +4/+4 until end of turn, both protecting our creatures from spot removal and providing a permanent or temporary stat boost respectively. Some removal options then join us in the CMC 2 slot with Inscription of Abundance, Ram Through, and Destructive Revelry. Inscription of Abundance has kicker for 2 and a green and lets us choose one of the following effects, or all 3 instead if the kicker cost is paid. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, have target player gain life equal to the greatest power among creatures they control, and or have target creature we control fight another target creature we don't control, giving us a decent suite of abilities to grow our creatures further, gain some life from our pumped creatures, or use them as removal, or all 3 if we have enough mana. Ram Through has target creature we control deal damage equal to its power to target creature we don't control, and if it has trample, has it deal the excess damage to its controller, serving as a decent one-sided fight effect and trample payoff to get us some extra burn when we use it. Destructive Revelry destroys target artifact or enchantment and burns its controller for 2, serving as a decent back row removal option with some burn attached for that extra reach. We'll also be running Starstorm, an X spell with cycling for 3 that deals X damage to each creature, giving us a scalable wipe that most of our creatures should be able to live through thanks to their counters, and at worst we can cantrip away to dig deeper into our deck. Finally, we close out this slot with Rapid Vigor, which regenerates all our creatures, making our creatures resilient against wipes and removal and ensuring that the turns we spent growing them don't go to waste. Reaching the CMC 3 slot, we start off with Beast Within and Chaos Warp, both of which deal with permanence, the first by destroying it and having its owner create a 3/3 in its place, and the latter shuffling it back into its owner's deck and having them reveal a top card of it, allowing them to put it into play if it's a permanent. Both being very flexible sources of removal that, despite their drawbacks, will be running for the sheer amount of threats they're capable of dealing with at instant speed. Then we wrap up this slot with Inspiring Call, which makes all our creatures we control with a +1/+1 counter indestructible until end of turn, and then draws us a card for each, serving as both an AoE source of protection against swipes and removal, as well as a potent source of card advantage to refill our hand afterwards. Finally, skipping to the CMC5 slot, we have our last instant with Return of the Wildspeaker, which has us choose one of the following: draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-humans we control, or give all non-humans we control +3/+3 until end of turn, giving us a flash speed way to either refill our hand or pump most of our board, either of which is great for our game plan. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, its top half brings us Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land from our deck into play tapped, the former being limited to basics and the latter to any non-forest basic land type, both giving us some cheap and efficient land-based ramp to help us grow our mana base in the early game. Then the latter half of this slot brings us some Gruul entrants with Domri's Ambush and Savage Twister. Domri's Ambush puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, then has it deal its power and damage to target creature or planeswalker we don't control, which we run, despite it being slow, to grow our creatures and deal with both creature and walker-based threats. Savage Twister is an X spell that deals X damage to all creatures, again giving us a scalable wipe that most of our board should be able to survive while leaving our opponent's boards in shambles. Reaching the CMC3 slot, we get to our final sorceries with Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, both of which search our deck for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into our hand, each providing us with immediate ramp and ensuring we make our next land drop to make sure our mana base continues to grow unimpeded. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. A single entrant leads us off in the CMC1 slot, that being Font of Fertility, which we can pay 1 a green and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, giving us another source of early ramp to help us grow and fix our mana base. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Ordeal of Nylea and Arnie Slays the Troll King. Ordeal of Nylea is an aura that gives the enchanted creature a +1/+1 counter whenever it attacks, and if the creature has 3+ counters on it when it attacks, it sacks itself to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, both serving as a ramp source and a way to generate counters all in a single package. Arnie Slays the Troll King is a saga whose first chapter has target creature we control fight target creature we don't control, its second chapter generating a red mana and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control, and its final chapter gaining us life equal to the greatest power among creatures we control, serving as both removal and counter distribution, while also giving us a solid amount of life gain to help pad our life totals. Moving on to the CMC3 slot, we have its trio of entrants with Garruk's Uprising, Rhythm of the Wild, and Snake Umbra. Garruk's Uprising, when it ETBs, draws us a card if we control a creature with 4+ power, and also draws us a card whenever a creature with 4+ power ETBs under our control, in addition to granting all our creatures trample, working nicely alongside our bigger creatures and counter distribution effects on ETB for some consistent card advantage while providing us yet another source of AoE trample. Rhythm of the Wild prevents our creature spells from being countered and gives non-token creatures we control riot, giving us another source of counter distribution as our creatures come into play, or alternatively haste if we need them to swing in immediately, while hosing our opponent's counter spells in the process. Snake Umbra is an aura with totem armor that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 and lets us draw a card whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, giving us an offensive source of card advantage that also protects the enchanted creature from destruction for some added durability. Finally, skipping to the CMC5 slot, we have our last enchantment with Glorious Sunrise, which, at the beginning of our combat phase, has us select one of the following. Creatures we control gain +1/+1 and trample until the end of the turn, target land taps for triple green until the end of the turn, draw a card if we control a creature with 3+ power, or gain 3 life. Its AoE pump and trample making our token-laden creatures even deadlier, while its ramp, draw, and life gain give us some additional utility as needed. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Skipping to the CMC2 slot, we have our only artifact with Swiftfoot Boots, an equipment that equips for 1 and gives the equipped creature hexproof and haste, serving as a means to screen our commander against targeted removal and quickly getting them into combat alongside their companions. That covers our artifact, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our Planeswalkers start off in the CMC3 slot with Domri, Anarch of Bolas, who comes into play with Reloyalty, gives all our creatures +1/+0, and has the following abilities. His +1 generates a red or green mana and prevents our creature spells from being countered for the turn, and his -2 has target creature we control fight target creature we don't control. His passive AoE Anthem pumping our creature's already impressive stats further, his ramp not only speeding up our mana curve but also protecting our spells from being disrupted, and his fight effect also allowing us to repeatedly turn our huge creatures into removal spells to deal with our opponent's problematic creatures, making him a solid walker, especially for only 3 mana. Our second and last Planeswalker is yet another Domri, this time Domri Chaosbringer, who comes into play with 5 loyalty and has the following abilities. His +1 generates a red or green mana, and if that mana is used to cast a creature spell, gives that creature Riot. His -2 lets us look at the top 4 cards of our deck and put 2 creatures from among them into our hand while sending the rest to the bottom in a random order, and his -8 gives us an emblem that, on each end step, creates a 4/4 beast token with Trample. Like his previous incarnation, providing us with ramp, but also adding some counter distribution to it thanks to Riot, subbing out the removal for card advantage that benefits our creature-heavy playstyle, and adding an ult that will flood the board with good-sized tramplers if we're lucky enough to get to it, making him a solid walker that meshes well with our game plan. That covers our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Mossfire Valley, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Crackground Pathway, which we can choose on which side it ETBs to produce either a red or a green, Cinderglade, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basics, taps for either of our colors and counts as a mountain and a forest, Rootbound Crag, which comes into play tapped unless we control a mountain or forest and taps for either of our colors, Game Trail, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a mountain or forest and taps for either of our colors, Highland Forest, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and counts as both a mountain and a forest, and finally Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped. For utility lands, we'll start off with Llanowar Reborn, Oran Reef the Vastwood, and Tyrite Sanctum. Llanowar Reborn comes into play tapped, taps for a green, and has Graft 1, enabling us to easily get a +1/+1 counter on our commander when they ETB or on another creature instead if we draw into it later. Oran Reef the Vastwood comes into play tapped, taps for a green, as well as letting us tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that ETB'd that turn, providing us with a repeatable way to get the initial +1/+1 counter on our creatures as they come into play. Tyrite Sanctum taps for a colorless and lets us either pay 2 and tap it to give target legendary creature the god subtype and a +1/+1 counter, or pay 4, tap it and sack it to give target god an indestructible counter, allowing us to repeatedly grow our commander and eventually make them very difficult for our opponents to interact with. Then we close out our utility lands with Nesting Grounds and Skark the Rage Pits. Nesting Grounds taps for a colorless and lets us pay 1 and tap it at sorcery speed to move a counter from one creature to another, serving as a means to get additional counters on our commander to empower them and their ability even further. Skark the Rage Pits also taps for a colorless and lets us pay a red, a green, and tap it to give target creature +1/+1 and trample until the end of the turn, supplying us with another source of trample and a small stat boost from our land slot. Finally, we're running 11 mountains and 12 forests as our basics to close out our land slot. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 37 creatures including the commander, 11 instants, 6 sorceries, 7 enchantments, 1 artifact, 2 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 37 sources of +1/+1 counter generation for themselves or others, 18 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, 19 cards that have or grant trample, 8 stat boosting effects, and 9 sources of protection, leaving us with a huge amount of +1/+1 counter generation and payoffs to work alongside our commander, plenty of sources of trample to ensure our creatures can reliably get in for damage, and additional pump effects outside our counters to have them hit even harder, and finally a good amount of protection to ensure that our pumped up creatures stick around to deal damage as our opponents attempt to remove them. For general deck stats, we have 13 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, all of which fit in line with what we expect to see for our deck's core parameters. Looking at our mana curve, we have 5 1-drops, 16 2-drops, 19 3-drops, 14 4-drops, 6 5-drops, 3 6-drops, and 1 7-drop, giving us a somewhat aggressive curve that helps get us bodies on board quickly to be pumped up by our commander and other effects, allowing us to begin pressuring the board with big tramplers as soon as possible. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.88, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some more sources of +1/+1 counter generation such as Grumgully the Generous, Thundering Mightmare, and Ruinous Intrusion would be decent additions to help grow our creatures even further, while additional counter payoffs such as Gyre Sage, Herd Baloth, and Scurry Oak can benefit from our counter distribution to give us additional ramp and board presence respectively. For upgrades, Hardened Scales, Branching Evolution, and Vorinclex Monstrous Raider all make our counter distribution effects even better by upping the amount of counters they generate. Colonian Hydra lets us double its own and all our other creatures' counters every time it swings in to make them exponentially growing threats, while Avabrook Caretaker gives us even more counter distribution and even AoE targeted removal protection once it transforms. The Ozolith will also make a good inclusion to make sure our counters don't go to waste as our creatures die, and Heroic Intervention would make sure they didn't die in the first place. And finally, to no one's surprise, the Great Henge makes it again as our priciest recommendation for upgrades, providing us with even more counter generation and card draw for our creature-heavy deck, and once again reminding us that this expensive piece of cardboard needs to be reprinted sometime in our lifetime. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Another thanks is in order for all the channel subs, as we've blasted through the 2.1k milestone and are well into 2.2 at this point. Thank you all for your support, as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Moving on to the results of last week's poll, after a tight race, it looks like the Geist partners of Rhoda, Geist Avenger, and Tim and Youthful Geist were able to claim the top spot, so look forward to a tap-down focused build featuring them next week. Now looking at this week's poll, we'll be bringing the entrants back up to 3, but bringing down their color identities to 1, with this week's monocolored entrants being Geralf Visionary Stitcher, Donald Herald of Wings, and Timothar Baron of Bats. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and what commanders from Crimson Vow you'd like to see in a future episode. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank All I Do Is EDH for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.